If I had had the awareness when I was presented with an idea that was iffy to go, let me think about that. I don't know if I actually agree with that. And not just going, oh, I'm told I need to, so I should. Then I wouldn't have all these things that have become so central to who I am and how my faith is defined that I realized, oh, I should never have taken that on. And now I'm stuck having to unlearn it because it's been a part of me for so long. Many of these things had nothing to do with God or had something to do with God, but it warped it. So what I need to do first is I need to figure out who I believe God to be.
Welcome to the podcast. If you're doubting or deconstructing, you're in the right place. On this podcast, we try to be totally honest about doubt while still being hopeful about faith in Christ. In this episode, I talk with Austin Noll, author of A Jumble of Crumple Papers and host of the Crumpled Papers Podcast. I found myself relating so much to what Austin had to say in his book, I wanted to talk with him more about it. And I mean, I don't really release a podcast episode unless I feel this way about it, but this conversation was great. And it brought so much clarity to why legalism, elitism, and church abuse lead to doubt and deconstruction. Enjoy the conversation.
Went into a church with Christian parents, and that's kind of where my journey starts from, and that's the origin of it all. I'm a writer, wrote this book. I'm a filmmaker as well. I'm a screenwriter. That's what I went to film school for at UCLA. That's what I do. I do that. I write for film, I write for my book, and I do a podcast. And that's my world right now. So
that's a great world.
It is a great world. That's what I'm into right now. And it's really, really awesome. It's fulfilling in different ways, each of those three things I do. So it's really cool.
Yeah, so you talked about being raised in a Christian home. Would you say that that's kind of how you came to faith, or is there a bit more to it than that? Might be a complicated question.
No, actually, it's a really simple question.
Okay, please tell.
Meaning, so much of it is wrapped around the fact that I was born into this church with my parents being devout Christians and it being just the way your life is expected to go. At a certain age, you're going to start studying the Bible. In our church, we did Bible studies that led us through what our church believed. And upon completing those, you get baptized. And it was expected at around 13, 14, if you were on the right track, this is what you would be doing. My faith in many ways was my own, but in so many ways, the foundation of it was an inherited faith from my parents, and it was expected. So there was no other option in my mind of going a different direction. So it was my own decision, but at the same time, I couldn't fathom any other way of my life going.
Yeah. So what would have been the pros and the cons of that situation from your perspective now?
Yeah, it's a good question. The pros, I think first and foremost, is the fact that many of the foundational elements and tenets of what I grew up being taught, I still believe, right? So despite the things that I go through and I've talked about in my book, I'm still a Christian. I still hold to a lot of those things. The cons are getting to a certain age and realizing a lot of the things I believe, whether or not they're true or not, the reason I believe them is because my parents believe them, or my leaders believe them, or I taught a Christian believes this. If you don't believe this, you're probably not a Christian. So, okay, I believe that. Not because I've wrestled with it enough to really decide, but do I believe that is true? Or it's just going to be, that's what I was taught. My parents believe it. It's almost a requisite to be included in this group to believe that certain thing. And that's a rough thing to disentangle once you get to that point of realizing that's where you are.
I just want to pull on that thread of disentangling. That's a great word. It's becoming more and more, I think, common for those in the space of like doubt and trying to hold on to faith and still believe. But in your book, you specifically talked about legalism and elitism, which you kind of touched on just a moment ago when you said like, you know, I need to believe these things in order to belong in this very specific group where we see ourselves as having the right doctrine or maybe being a little bit better than those other churches. What were the effects of growing up in a community where legalism and elitism got tangled with your Christian beliefs? How did you sort that out?
Oh, it's complicated. So the next layer is, in this scenario, my scenario is, we were given these ideas and these beliefs and these practices and told, this is the only right way to do it. My church believed that they were the one true church. When you were baptized into our church, they wouldn't call you a Christian, they'd call you a disciple. Because in our church, disciple was a term that signified pretty much a super Christian. We would even have it where if someone came to our church from a different church, we would then have to rebaptize them into our church because we made the real Christians, the disciples. So there was such a weight on always outlining the difference between the way we did things and the way other churches did things, the things we believed and the things other churches believed, and making sure all our members in our church saw the difference. They're doing something, they're trying, their hearts may be there, but who knows if they're going to make the finish line because they're not doing it the exact way we're doing it, and thus they're doing it to a slightly wrong degree. So my faith growing up in a legalistic, works-based culture was so defined by fear. If you're banking on your church being the one true church, then you can't base it off of the status of someone's heart or their heart is, because you can't see that. So the only way to be able to say, oh, our church is right, that church is wrong, is to go, the things we're doing based on what we believe is different than what they're doing, so we're right. You can't go, oh, their hearts are different at different places, because you can't see that and distinguish, oh, that's wrong, we're right, if that makes sense. So much of the way we were viewed and judged and expected to be as Christians, as believers, was based so much around the external ways we lived. If what we're doing is against what our church says the right way to do it is, then we're automatically not being faithful or not being godly. We were just taught that we weren't allowed to trust ourselves, which is a whole different topic in itself, but a lot of fear, to answer your question, a lot of fear.
I think the logic that you just laid forward is like, you have to agree with the church, because if you disagree with the church, then you might not belong to the church. Right. And if you don't belong to that church, then you're not a real Christian anymore.
Exactly.
Right. So it's like, for you to remain a true Christian, you have to basically do everything they're asking of you so you can stay within the group. I resonate with that. I wouldn't say I grew up in necessarily such an extreme, like that extreme a version of it, but certainly I grew up with this tension of like, maybe we're not like the only Christians, but we're certainly the best ones.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I got that way of thinking into my system too, that if I were to change even my like doctrinal beliefs around like Calvinism or Arminianism or interpretations of Genesis or Revelation, for some reason, those two,
right. The beginning of the end. Yeah.
That if you take different approaches there, that you're, even if you like hold a high view of scripture, that it's God's word, even if you have that and then you interpret it differently, you're doing it wrong. So that tension of like, once you disagree with us, then you've really separated yourself from us, and now you're no longer at the elite level. I certainly grew up with that, and for sure felt the fear in that when I started to doubt those things. Would you say that would be similar to how it affected your faith as well? Just like fear around being able to question anything?
Oh, absolutely. And what you were talking about just then about, it doesn't matter if my heart is really set on Jesus or learning about God or in the right place, however you define that. The big thing about it is that distinction between unity and conformity, right? Where so many churches will on Sunday preach the need to be unified as a body. They're really preaching conformity, because the second you tell them that you have a belief that differs, they either try to snuff it out or try to cast you out if you won't be snuffed out. And so unity in their minds equals everyone believing the exact same thing. But unity is the fact that we've all acknowledged that, no, our hearts and our desire is set on Jesus and on doing this the best way we see fit. Also acknowledging that God speaks to us all in different ways. And thus, we're going to believe different things at different times, variations of certain things. There's some things we can agree on that we all should believe if we want to be able to be conducive here. But there's so much room for variability in this stuff. And we can be in a church body and believe slightly different things, but different things at different times, because we're all on different journeys being led to different realizations about every different scripture and a biblical idea. It's a big nuanced thing. And if we're all set that, no, the end goal, the place we're trying to be is the same, then we can all be here in harmony and even allow those variabilities to enhance each of our own faith journeys, because we're not all in the same place, which can be so conducive to each other's faith to learn what we don't know.
What you're making me think of is the fact that as I've got into my 30s now, I realized that from when I started following Jesus around, 14, 15, until my mid-20s, I think I loved God, but I think the majority of my effort in faith and religion was to get really clear on like doctrinal stuff, like just like here's like the textbook stuff. And I got really good at following the cultural guidelines of my subcultural Christianity. And basically, if you express the doctrine in words, and then if you follow all the rules, no one will ever challenge you on your faith because you will actually be perceived as really mature, even though in my heart, I was like anxious and afraid and doubting. My motivation was not out of the love of God and others. It was actually around other things like acceptance and fear. Legalism and elitism, it can produce a life that fits really well in a Christian subculture, but it doesn't have this internal relationship with God that is vibrant.
To add on that real quick, that was a great point there is for me and my peers and my friends, what that resulted in was a group of people who sincerely really desired God and to the best of their knowledge knew they knew and loved him. But our relationship wasn't with him, it was with the church, right? The church became, instead of a vessel to God, it was a buffer between us and God, kind of a wall there that, oh, we can do all these things, believe these things, and told, oh, you have a great relationship with God. You know him so well because you're doing these things and know these things. But the only dynamic that those beliefs and practices fortified was us with the church, not with God. If we had to back away from that stuff, we wouldn't know where to start with how to interact with God. It influenced the way we navigated our faith in a big way.
I think that this idea of legalism, just like it just pops up, and elitism just pops up, even in churches that all the leaders would sit around a table and go like, no, we would never want to do that. I think it's just a human inclination, right?
It is.
So
it absolutely
I think
is.
it's something we all have to work through. And if I can, you can tell me if I'm not getting this right, but basically you're saying what that did was give you a map for how to be accepted in church, but it didn't give you a map for how to have a vibrant relationship with God.
Yeah, and that map, if traversed well enough, you would be told, oh, your relationship with God is aces. You've done it. But yet we've rarely experienced anything on that side. We've only stuck to the map and haven't experienced God authentically.
Was that the source of your doubts or a part of it?
In a way, it was the beginning of that path that led to that. What really happened for me is, I think it happens to a lot of people, is especially, once again, people who have been in a culture like this that is so bent on the legalism and the elitism, right? We're doing it the right way. And the pressure for certainty and all these things and knowing these things and not questioning them, right? It's slowly realizing, okay, I now have this entire vase that I'm told can never crack. And it's comprised of all of these ideas and beliefs that I've accumulated that are all 100% foolproof, right? But one thing happens, and I see one little crack in that vase that I'm told can never crack. And the problem is now, okay, there's one crack, one belief, one thing didn't line up for me now. How many cracks are there able to be in this vase? It's that stark realization of being told questioning's out of the picture. That's not a thing we do here. Oh my gosh, I'm finding myself questioning that thing. So now I'm like, oh my gosh, which ones were right? Which ones are wrong? Which ones are healthy? Which ones are not? Because I'm being hurt by these things. And I was told all these things. If I were to follow all these things and believe them all, I'd be fine for the rest of my life. And I'm not. So it was a transitional thing to that. Yeah.
I had a friend call it a rigid fragility.
Ooh,
like the
that's
idea
good.
that everything's so rigid that like in order, like, and this is true in physics, right? If something is really rigid, for it to bend, like it will break. But if something has a little bit of flexibility, then it can actually bend and hold together well. And it feels like, yes, in our faith, maybe we'd hold on to like the existence of God or the resurrection of Jesus. We'd say these are, and the truth is, if that does bend and break, then so does Christianity. Right. So
exactly, that's the foundation that it all rests on. That's it.
Yeah, so the foundation needs to be solid, but there are these other things where there's like a little more flex in them. In your book, I underlined this because I thought it was interesting, and I think it relates to what you just said. You said there's one thing that I can wholeheartedly say I regret from the first 20 years of my life. I regret how little I doubted. I don't necessarily disagree with it or even want to push back
Sure.
on it. It's certainly a bold statement. And certainly for those who are doubting, they'd be like, wow, why would you ever say that? Why would you ever say that? So why did you say that?
Because it was a great way to end the first sentence in that chapter. No, it's a very intriguing statement. And it's not just a dramatic hook for that chapter. I believe it 100% for me. If I had had the awareness somehow when I was presented with an idea that was iffy, being able to go, do I believe that? And not just going, oh, I'm told I need to, so I should. If I just was able to go, let me think about that. I don't know if I actually agree with that. I got to work through that. Then I would be in such a different place. I wouldn't have all these things that have become so central to who I am and how my faith is defined, that I realized, oh, I should never have taken that on. And now I'm stuck having to unlearn it because it's been a part of me for so long. That would have saved me from a lot.
Did you ever feel like when you were being taught some things in church that were maybe legalistic or elitist, did those red flags come up, but you just felt like you didn't have anywhere to talk about this stuff?
That's a good question. I think for so long, because college or the last year in high school is when I first started to see some things, those first cracks. And then by my second year of college, I was gone. So those 2 or 3 years was that process of me getting to a place where I realized.
By gone, you just mean gone to college.
Having left my childhood church.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry,
I'm glad you had defined that. That's good.
Yeah.
So it took about 3 years from that first crack to me realizing, okay, this is enough, or I need to step away. Between, when I was born in 18, there were no cracks. So especially when you're born into something, but at any stage, if you're in it for long enough and you're told whatever you're experiencing or learning is normal, that's what is normal. It doesn't matter how weird it is. If you have believed that it's normal, then you're going to justify it somehow. So we would have things for sure over the years that were rigid or that were really over the top or that were weird, but it would be a thing that would usually become like the end of a joke going, oh man, you know how it is. So there were red flags, but we were always able to justify it because our belief that we were part of the right thing was a higher, more strong force.
One thing I wanted to kind of ask you about specifically, because you mention it explicitly in your book, and I think it's something that people find hard to discuss, is this idea of spiritual abuse. In church, it's like you can kind of talk about doubt.
Yeah.
And it's facets of like intellectual and emotional doubt and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But then you go online, and then what really often dominates the conversation there is these ideas of deconstruction and spiritual abuse.
Right.
I think the Christian ought to engage meaningfully in both of those. And so I just wanted to kind of bring that up to you. Like when you mention spiritual abuse in your book, what do you mean by that? I think people's immediate thoughts would be like some horrible scandal like Ravi Zacharias or something. And it is that. But what else could it be in other expressions?
I'm glad you brought up that like the big scandals are what my friends and I were used to defining as spiritual abuse growing up, because that's exactly what it is. That is spiritual abuse. The big church things almost did a disservice to us because we define spiritual abuse as only existing in that extreme of a realm. What I've come to understand as spiritual abuse is any type of abuse, right? Any type of harm, whether it's emotional, verbal, physical, sexual, psychological abuse, done and inflicted under the guise of God, the authority of a church. It's abuse just done, and the excuse or justification given is because of some will of God, which really conflates things when you having to process what you've been through. When I started writing this book, I wasn't really thinking about spiritual abuse. I was thinking about, these are experiences that I know a lot of people who went through stuff like this can relate to. But as I was going and immersing myself in other books and other podcasts and other stuff about it, I slowly came to terms with the fact that, did I go through spiritual abuse? And now I'm at the point where like I absolutely did in so many ways. But at the time it was like, no. Spiritual abuse is the big stuff. But there were so many instances where I was experiencing shame or condemnation. My view of God, my view of myself, my view of others was really, really harmed. And the reasoning being, this is what God wants. This is what leadership needs. Spiritual abuse actually, like the margin for what can be defined as it is a lot larger and wider than we often give it credit for. And so we don't always define it and discern it when it happens. realizing that's what I went through and a lot of my friends went through allowed us to view it in that perspective of, oh, that was spiritual abuse. So I'm trying to disentangle who I believe God to be from who he was made to be to inflict these things on me.
This topic's always so tricky.
It is.
Because I think especially within the church, because there's something that we would call conviction, which is like there are moments when you might feel contrite for your sin, like as in, oh man, I did this evil thing and I actually feel like regretful of having done that.
Oh yeah.
So that's like an uncomfortable emotion because God is condemning a thing that you did and said, that actually was evil. It harmed you and others and dishonored me, So I think what's challenging is that I think then people in the church sometimes who haven't experienced spiritual abuse go like, wait a second, sometimes church makes you feel uncomfortable things. So let's grant that and move it out of the way.
Oh yeah.
But then basically what I heard you say is that spiritual abuse is saying God judges or condemns or is angry or rejects a person or on a basis that God, the scriptures actually say God does not reject you for that. So that's where I think it does make sense that it would tie to legalism, like this idea like, no, you're not good enough because you did this thing. And then you look and you're like, but God doesn't condemn that thing. Like God doesn't condemn me for, I'm trying to think of an example. Holding hands with your girlfriend could be one.
Right.
It's like someone might like be really like, whoa, you can't do that. That's wrong and all this. And you might be like, but I'm not sure God is condemning me for that action if I am doing it with a pure heart. If nothing else, it's important to get out there for those who are wrestling that they may have been offered a narrative of God that condemns them or shames them. And they need to disentangle when that's a subculture or a group of Christians who are saying that, but not actually God. And then when that gets enforced in God's name, it can become spiritual abuse. Would you agree with that? I guess we're trying to work out like a definition and examples, but I think it's important.
Oh, I think you're spot on. And I think too, right, that difference between, oh yeah, God will make me feel uncomfortable. I can be embarrassed in a dynamic with some situation with God. I can feel embarrassed or guilty even, right? But God won't condemn us, right? There is no condemnation in Christ. Jesus covered all of it. There's also no shame. Those two things, God will never make us feel. And if shame and condemnation are successfully given to us and we take it on, it makes us so much more vulnerable to mistreatment because our value of ourselves is decreased. And therefore, when people place toxic standards, expectations, rules on us, there's such a wider margin that it is allowed to live in before we're even aware that it's mistreatment. And because of that, abusive churches, toxic churches are able to run free with how thin they stretch these people and the ways they mistreat them. And the people believe that it's in service to God and their suffering is because God willed it to be. And it's so far from healthy.
Were there any stories in your book that you think would illustrate that kind of thing well? You shared a lot of stories. I just wondered if you think if there's maybe an instance or two that would help people understand this dynamic of what spiritual abuse could look like.
My book, right, once again, takes place between being born and leaving in my second year of college. So it's largely in the realm of youth group, teen ministry, campus ministry, those years. During that time, I think one of the biggest, most prevalent dynamics is guy and girl relationships, trying to figure that out. So there's a lot having to do with having to navigate that in this kind of, once again, legalistic setting where there's a right way to do stuff, there's a wrong way to do stuff. And the line differentiating right and wrong was very far forward from what I believe the margin to be of what's right and wrong with the guy and girl dynamic. So, for example, there was a girl that I had feelings for, and she had feelings, there was mutual. And wanting to be the godly guy, to lead her godly, I had asked the head minister of our church for some advice. So I was taken out to brunch, and long story short, we were prohibited from talking to each other or texting or communicating in any way. At first it was, just 2 weeks to sort out your priorities, make sure God's first, which at that point, okay, like that, I could see that totally being a thing. It lasted for 3.5 years. And we were never really given a justification as to why we weren't allowed to talk. And throughout that time, slowly and slowly, but gradually, but consistently, it was sewn into us that we just couldn't trust ourselves. We just weren't ready. We weren't good enough. We weren't allowed to do this because it was us. And at the end of the day, we had never done anything bad. Our desires were completely innocent. We just wanted to get to know each other as friends. And it had gotten so weird that we were communicating through like the comment section of Instagram posts. So we couldn't text, and we felt terrible about doing that because we're like, oh, we can't be talking at all. And this was 2 years later into it. We're like, we shouldn't be talking. We're terrible. So we stopped doing that. And there was one Sunday where this girl needed something from me. So she texted me about it, some logistical thing. And I responded, and we felt terrible that we had even communicated. And one of our leaders had found out we had gotten one text there and one text back. And the next thing I knew, all these people, some of which didn't even know me, were coming up to me saying, hey, I heard you guys had crossed boundaries in your relationship.
Wow.
This leader had told everyone, oh, they had crossed boundaries, which without any explanation, your mind goes to all kinds of things, not, oh, they had shared a text message. And that's one example of such a convoluted scenario, but it was all this shame. And at the same time, it went on for 4 years because it was normal and it was the right way to do it. And we saw how it was affecting us, but at the same time, oh no, that's how we do this thing. So it feels weird, but I guess it's the right thing to do.
And I think if I remember the details right from what you reported in the book, and you've just said this, like you were both prayerfully approaching this.
Oh yeah.
If I recall correctly, your parents knew about it and were on board with it. Like, yeah, like, you know,
that's a huge thing is both of our parents signed off on it, said, let's do it. And the leadership of our church said, no, they can't. So their authority superseded our parents.
And your own ability to discern what God was leading you both in. It's a clear illustration then for now, if you do this thing that you feel no conscience like issue with, and your parents are discerning, you know, this has the potential to be like good and beautiful.
Yeah.
But now if you do it, you've done something wrong and you're being shamed because these leaders are deciding to impose on you a standard that God is not holding you to. With disobeying it comes shame and rejection. And even like your reputation, your community getting damaged. Yeah. I mean, I am like absolutely horrified as someone who was a youth pastor for like a decade to say publicly, oh, they crossed boundaries in their relationship is like horrific. Like even if that were some like really horrible instance, you still don't go around telling people that.
Right.
Now I can totally understand why that would cause unbelievable distress and shame.
Oh, yeah.
For someone listening who might be going, oh, am I experiencing this spiritual abuse? It gives them a sense of framework for what it means to trust yourself versus like this leadership thing, because that could sound very Disney, like follow your heart, but you're not saying that. You're saying trusting that you also, with your parents and other wise leaders, can discern God's voice, and it's not just a matter of submitting to the spiritual authority, especially if they're putting on you something that is not what God actually says. Sometimes people perceive doubt as this kind of like intellectual thing, like is Christianity true? But for you, did it come more out of this like social, cultural element of church, like the legalism, elitism, and like this spiritual abuse? Is that what kind of at its core rattled your faith?
Yes. The thing that ended up causing such ramifications for me was how conflated God was with what our church told us how to, like what we should believe and stuff. So everything the leader told us was what God wanted. Every way that scripture was interpreted was exactly how God intended it to be. Once again, if I'm being dealt all this shame by leaders in the name of God, then God is okay with me feeling that shame and wants it to be that way, right? Once I'm at the point where I'm seeing cracks, it's not an automatic thing of, oh, my church was wrong. It's, oh, maybe if this is who God is, I don't want God. Because I had to realize many of these things had nothing to do with God, or had something to do with God, but it warped it. Where my problem isn't with God, or is it with God, or is it not? So what I need to do first is I need to figure out who I believe God to be. Because the depiction of God who I have now after 19 years in this church, I'm realizing is not who God is, but who is he? So I need to do some intentional work to figure out who I believe God to be truly. So it all relies on having to disentangle God from the harmful experiences and ideas and beliefs and practices that I've learned and I believed were all intertwined with who God was.
I think the practical follow-up I would ask then is, how did you go about doing that? Because that's the hard part.
Oh my gosh. Mm-hmm.
I think that we would all agree, again, to just kind of paint some of a spectrum here, like everyone has to do this, I believe, at some level. You're going to get dysfunctional human beings who are misrepresenting God. And you could get a really small dose of that or a really huge dose of that. But we all need to disentangle who God actually is from the caricatures we receive from others, even well-meaning others, but they're not always well-meaning.
Oh yeah, absolutely though. Mm-hmm.
I'm just really curious, like another quote that really jumped out to me in your book was, while doubt is a question posed, cynicism is a question answered, usually by the voice of our own pain.
Mm.
I mean, I thought that was really poetically said. And it certainly relates to kind of where we've entered into this point of the story where it's like, you have these questions once you realize, like, I actually need to work through some stuff. And a cynical voice can rise that just says, is it even worth sorting it out to be connected with this thing called Christianity or Christians? I really personally resonate too with the idea of church hurt making it hard to kind of engage these questions and puts us on edge, especially when we enter into certain church spaces. How have you combated that cynicism as you try to go about asking your good questions?
Cynicism, it's an understandable result of things that you go through at the hands of people, right? Because, oh, I trusted so-and-so, I trusted this system, this church, these people, or those people hurt me despite my trust in them. So I can't trust those people or that kind of person again, because if I do, I could get hurt. Or for a long time, whenever I would go into a different church after I left my childhood church, it would immediately be all these voices in my head going, oh, I wonder what that pastor actually thinks about this, or I wonder how this youth group's being led, or I wonder where this money's going to, or how whatever, all these different things that really locked me out of potential for something good to be there. And a big thing was realizing that people are people. Stuff's gonna end up being hurtful. There's going to be wounds, there's going to be pain. And that can sometimes push that cynicism because, oh, people are people, then anywhere I go, there's a possibility of something happening. My cynicism isn't always invalid. Sometimes it's accurate in terms of, oh, this could happen. Oh, yeah, you're right. It could. What cynicism often does is it leaves out God's role in the equation, where people are people. But the thing is, God's there. I fully believe God was in my church growing up. He was with those people. He's everywhere. And when I'm cynical and don't acknowledge that God has potential to work in any scenario, my cynicism wins out almost. And I rob myself of the opportunity to experience something God could be offering me because of the fear, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I think there's something beautiful and hopeful there to say cynicism. It's like, yeah, you can't deny that some people are going to hurt you and some people are not trustworthy, but that doesn't mean that the grand narrative is devoid of those of trust. Like, you can still trust because God is trustworthy and he's the defining character of the story, not these people.
Yeah.
I resonate with the hopefulness of that. And I appreciate that you included that in your book, because honestly, like, having read about many of your experiences, I'm like, yeah, I'd be cynical.
Yeah, right. And it's understandable for people.
Yeah, it is. And we have to make space for that. And I'm just glad that we're having a conversation about how to actually, like, root some hopefulness in it rather than just going like, keep going to church because church is good and you got to do the church thing. There's a more complex conversation there about learning to have a healthy relationship with church. So I feel like we've already kind of touched on this, but it might be helpful. Like, in your book, a central illustration is this idea of crumpled papers. Like, metaphorically, what are crumpled papers? Can you give me some examples of those for you?
Absolutely. So my book is called A Jumble of Crumple Papers. And the metaphor is, on my podcast, I always say at the very end, crumpled papers represent the ideas or beliefs that we may have at one point believed with full certainty, but at some point realized we need to reevaluate our perspective on. So if you envisioned every idea or belief you have ever taken on as each being written on individual slips of paper. So every idea you ever believed about yourself, about God, about the world, organized by category or topic or whatever. Here's what I believe about pizza. Here's what I believe about the internet. All these stacks of slips of paper that are each individual beliefs or ideas about that certain thing. Then when you get to a point where you realize, I don't know if I believe that in the same way or at all, then you try to pull it out, the whole thing topples oftentimes because they're all so tightly connected. In terms of my faith, I don't believe this one idea that I was told is 100% true. What does that mean for all the rest of the beliefs I was told were 100% true? And what happens is all these neatly stacked papers become a jumble of crumpled papers where they're all kind of mushed together. And we're kind of left with the daunting task of having to intentionally reach our hand in there, pull out one crumpled paper at a time, uncrumpling it, smoothing it out, reading it, observing it, analyzing it, and really doing the work to figure out if we still believe it or not anymore, or in the same way or not. And if we don't believe it in the same way anymore, we can just crumple back up and toss it away. But if we decide, oh no, I still believe that's true, then we set it aside and make a new pile of all the beliefs that we've tried and tested and still believe are true.
So many books I read, I'm like, oh, here's their metaphor for deconstruction.
You got a whole bunch of different ones.
This is like everyone. Some people, it's renovating a house, and like it's always,
and they're all very spot on. They're all very similar.
They're all great, and this one's helpful too. I love it because some of the iconography of Truth Snack is a crumpled piece of paper.
Yeah, I noticed. That's great.
I've never said this publicly, but it doesn't matter. But like that is an intentional part of it, actually. Like that same idea of like faith is complicated and messy. And it's presented as this really clean piece of paper, but actually sometimes it's got lots of creases and stains on it and that kind of thing. So that is where that comes from, though I'm sure no viewer has ever thought about that. My question for you is, in the midst of everything you've experienced in terms of like legalism and elitism and even some spiritual abuse, at some point I'm sure you pulled out this piece of paper that said Jesus rose from the dead, because it's so interconnected with this whole thing, as it should be. What has helped you hold on to that piece of paper and not crumple it up and throw it out?
One thing that I've experienced that I was so uncomfortable with is the fact that faith is, you're not at 100% all the time. Like you're not foolproof, 100% certainty every day. Faith is tested, and it's not, people think of faith testing as a make or break scenario where you could fail or succeed. No. Faith testing, I think your faith is always being tested. It's deepening, and it's also sometimes weakening, but it's evolving. I believed I had to have my faith, or at least pretend that my faith was always so secure. And when I experienced after leaving and deconstructing my certain parts of my faith and really going through all this stuff, is realizing, man, my faith is in flux all the time. It's different levels of strength, and that's okay, because as years go by, I realized, oh, my faith has been deepened as a result of those valleys and mountains and going up and down. So the reason I still believe it, a big thing, is because I've been allowed the space to not believe it. In the situation I grew up in, we were never allowed to admit that we were having trouble believing that. When you think about it from a non-Christian perspective, that's crazy. Like, to say, okay, this guy died and rose from the dead, and you can never question it ever. Are you insane? I'm not allowed to wrestle with it or have any questions about it. I just have to believe it because it's true. And of course, I believe it's true. But the thing is, I've been able to voice the times where I'm wavering and be like, I don't know, do I? And what those questions do is allows me to look into it and read more about it and read more scripture and pray about it and do all this stuff, because I'm allowed to confront that questioning about it, which gives me the conviction of, no, okay, now this is my belief now, not a belief I have to just believe.
I understand exactly what you're saying. Yeah. But it's something that almost never gets expressed in church. Yeah. And I talked about it in a few videos ago, where it's like some people believe Jesus rose to the dead, not because it's perfectly obvious and not because they have to, but because they actually think it's true.
Right.
And I understand what you're saying, because you're like, the space to conclude that it's not true actually gives us the free choice, sometimes for the first time in our lives, to go, I'm actually going to choose that I believe this. Because before, the pressure was always to be like, well, it's obvious, why wouldn't you believe it? Or to be like, I kind of have to conclude this, otherwise I lose my family and my whole community. But like the moment that you actually take the risk of going, I'm not going to like default assume it's true. And then when you conclude it is, somehow it feels like believing it for the first time.
Yeah.
Your story has all this coercive pressure in it. And like pressure has never caused a seed to grow.
That's huge. That's good.
You know, it's that it just doesn't help. It just needs it needs nourishment. It needs the conditions for growth. It needs good soil and water and light. Like these are the things it needs. And I think one of those life-giving things, as we've just like discussed, is the freedom to choose, which Christ clearly respects, like in the narratives in John where he's like to his disciples, like, are you going to leave too? Like everyone's leaving. Yeah. Do you want to leave? And he like gives them a real out, which is crazy because he wants them to choose what they basically do. Peter's like, I think that you're the Holy One of God.
Right.
So I'm going to stick with this. And that doesn't mean that Peter doesn't deny him later and then come back around. It's still messy, but like Christ clearly honors their freedom to choose. One last question. You never called attention to this, but I really noticed this, is that several times you mentioned your parents. You always mention them so positively. You even thanked them in the acknowledgement. What about your parents' love and guidance? Do you think any of that really helped you hold on to your faith as you went through this process?
Absolutely, because they were the type of people where if they found themselves disagreeing with something that the church told them, they wouldn't just allow themselves to be snuffed out and conform. So when I went through stuff like that, at church it was one environment, and at home it was much different, where those questions were engaged and I was listened to and heard in a way that at church it was always an agenda to get me back in line believing the same thing, where at home it was nurturing those questions and trying to figure out what I actually believe. They never sided with the church innately as just a loyalty thing, which a lot of people do because they're protecting that system at the expense sometimes of their kids or people they love. It was always, okay, how can we best protect you? But we're also going to point out what times we think you're right, what times we think the church has something to offer. That care and that self-autonomy that they expressed in themselves really affected me in terms of, no, I can be confident that I can do things without having to do everything through the church, which is doing things I don't agree with. And they went through a lot of the same stuff I did at the same times. And when I left, they left a month later because they were seeing the same things. And at the place where they realized it was more harm than good, they were able to leave as well and not just stay. Like many people stay because it's a place they know, people they know, they don't want to lose what they have. It was hard, but they left too.
It sounds like, despite how difficult it was, they helped you learn how to navigate this kind of disentangling that you had to go through. As we wrap up, anything left unsaid, like anything that you wanted to share that I didn't give you the space to, or I didn't ask a question, or is there anything just in your mind or heart that you're like, man, I really just want to say this? The floor is yours.
A big thing that comes up a lot with my book or with my podcast episodes, the recurring theme is that God is bigger than we make him to be in so many cases. You know, in environments like I grew up in or different things like that, it's we make God, we push him into a box that helps us with our agendas and our needs, but ends up making him so much smaller and less powerful than he is. I remember feeling like, oh, doubting this or having a question about this really might be infringing on some area that God wouldn't like me to go on. But I realize now how naive it was. I'm not shameful about it, but it was so naive because God is so big, where he looks at a question like that and goes, "Do you think that was infringing on me? Man, you could have gone so much deeper with that, and I'd be okay with it. I'm bigger than that. I invite the questions." And if you're at your lowest, where your faith is holding on by a single thread, I still got you. I can handle it. God can handle this stuff, and he's so much bigger.
Thanks for listening. If this podcast has been helpful to you, one way that you can help others find it is by giving it a 5-star rating on your podcast app. And as always, if you have something to add to what we've just discussed, don't hesitate to reach out at matt@truthsnack.ca. Until next time.